Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. It's been great. I've never spoken to an audience of fish before, so that's a first. It's pretty awesome. So I'm going to introduce myself briefly a bit as well. I'm Leah. If you've ever heard my name before, it's probably due to one of my open source projects. You can find them on GitHub or my website. The most popular of which are Prism.js, Doublet, Prefix Free, and CSS3test.com. You're going to see some of them in my talk. I'm also, like Camu mentioned, I'm an invited expert in the CSS Working Group. I used to work for W3C in the past, and these days I'm writing my first book for O'Reilly, which is going to be called CSS Secrets, and it's going to be released in 2014. So if you like this talk, look out for it. So I'm well aware that this is a JavaScript conference, and I love JavaScript, don't get me wrong, but this talk is more about how you don't need to use JavaScript for everything, because sometimes it results to more maintainable code and less code to use CSS for some things. One of those things is transitions and animations. So in the olden days, which is, for some people, it's still the present, when we used CSS to change something, the transitions were abrupt. For example, here, when I hover over this button, its background changes and also something appears. You can see the relevant CSS code on the side. And you can see that there's no transition. Everything just magically appears out of nowhere. This is bad user experience. We might not notice it because we're used to understanding how stuff works. But for people that aren't as used to computers as much as we are, it might be very confusing. For example, my favorite example of this is the minimizing effect that OS X has. If you've ever used Mac OS, you're probably familiar with it, how when you minimize a window, it does this effect before it disappears. It doesn't just magically disappear out of the screen. The reason this happens is that it's not just Apple's way of showing us that they're cool and they can do nice animations. It actually serves a purpose. For people that aren't very tech savvy, it shows them where the window went. We might not often think about that, because obviously we know where the window went. It's on the dock, we can find it. It's pretty obvious stuff, right? But it's not obvious for everybody. So this helps people that aren't as accustomed to using UIs to know where it went and how to bring it back. Of course, sometimes delays are even worse. I'm not saying you should, after this talk, you should go to every CSS code you've written and add tons of transitions. That's horrible. That's even worse. Especially for advanced users, if you're delaying them with a transition that serves no purpose because they know what's going on, it's much worse than everything being abrupt. For example, the text editor I like to use is called Espresso. Not many people use it, but I kind of like it. So even though it has lots of nice features, there's something that really bothers me. When you press Command and L to go to a specific line in your code, there is this very long animation for the window to appear that lets you type the line you want to go to. That really bugs me every time. It bugs me so much that I end up not even using this feature, just manually looking for the line of code I want to go to. Because usually, when you want to go to a specific line of code, you don't want to go, you don't just sit around thinking, oh, I want to go to line 120, I think it's a cool line. Usually it's because you're debugging something, you saw an error message, type error on line 120, and you're frustrated. What the hell did I screw up this time? So you're going to go there and see what went wrong. You don't want to be delayed with animations. You know where the window came out from. You know what's going on. You're a developer, for fuck's sake. So yeah, don't piss off your users. You should take it on a case-by-case basis. Do I need to use a transition here? Would it help? It's always a trade-off. It's a trade-off between delaying and making your UI more understandable. And the more advanced your users, the less transitions you should probably use, and or the quickest you should make them. Anyway, so assume we want to animate the background color of an element. In the past, we would probably include like a huge library, for example, jQuery, and sometimes we might even need to include an extra plugin. And then we would have to write JavaScript to do something like this. This is just an example. I know it could be done better. So in this case, we've included a total of 93 kilobytes minified just to do a transition. How many of you have included a library, any JavaScript library in your page, just to be able to do transitions or animations? Be honest. So this is pretty horrible. We don't really need to do this anymore, because we have CSS transitions now. So I'm not going to dwell on the basics, but for example, in this very simple example, you have a button. It changes its color when you hover over it, and it happens abruptly like CSS 2.1 used to be. If the way to use a very, very simple transition is to write something like this. This tells the browser, any property you can possibly transition, please transition it and make it last 1 second. So now, when I hover over it or out of it, it happens smoothly and it takes 1 second. You can even have different transitions on the hover state. For example, if I specify 0 seconds here, when I hover on the button, it happens immediately, but when I hover out of it, it happens smoothly. This might be useful, for example, when you want to do something and the user is in a rush and you don't want to delay them with fancy transitions, but when on the out state, you have more time to do a nice transition. So this is like the simplest possible way to do a CSS transition. But before I move on to other examples, I know what many of you are thinking. Yeah, this is cool stuff, but come on, I can't use it yet, because, come on, won't somebody think of the browsers? The browser support for this is terrible. I can't use it in my projects today. So let's get this out of the way first, because I don't want you to be thinking about this throughout my talk. I want you to be focusing on the code. So this is the browser support for transitions and animations today. Basically, they're supported by almost every browser in use today, except IE9 and below. This means that worldwide, at least, I know in Asia the numbers are slightly worse, but worldwide, this is about 80% of your users. And I know you might be thinking, what about the other 20%? I don't want my website to break for 1 out of 5 people. Well, the thing is, these features are designed in such a way that your website won't break for the people who use old browsers. There just won't be an effect. There just won't be a transition. It won't be as easy to use, but it will still work. Everything would still work if you write your code properly. If you write your code with graceful degradation in mind, this shouldn't be a problem. And the time you save by doing it with CSS transitions and animations instead of JavaScript, and the way your code is much more organized because the style is in the CSS file. It's not scattered around your JavaScript. I think it makes it worth it. So here's another example. There's a div. When I'm pressing my keyboard arrows, it grows because this transition is applied to it. It's a very simple transition that I showed earlier. So the HTML and CSS code looks like this. Obviously, the CSS code is a bit longer than this, but this is the parts you should be concerned about. It's just a div, a class of lightbox. It has a width and height of 0, and when I press my keyboard arrow keys, I apply a class of current, which makes it grow. So as the class lightbox probably gives away, this is not the kind of transition I wanted. I wanted a transition that looks like these lightbox galleries where you have when the image grows vertically, and then it grows horizontally, and then when it shrinks, it does it the reverse way. It first shrinks horizontally and then vertically. So is this the only kind of CSS transition you can do, everything happening at the same time? Because we don't want this. We want the width to be first and the height to be second, so that we sequence those transitions and we create this very popular lightbox effect. It turns out you can do this with CSS, but I first need to tell you 3 more things about CSS transitions that might seem useless. The first 2 might seem useless, but they become really useful when I tell you the third one that binds it all together. The first thing is you can constrain transitions by CSS property. If I specify a CSS property here, only that property will be transitioned. So here, when I do this, when I press my keyboard arrow keys again, it's only the height that transitions smoothly. The width just jumps to the end goal abruptly, like in CSS 2.1. The second thing I wanted to show you is transition delays. If I specify a second time value here, for example, 1 second, the transition will take 1 second to start. It becomes more clear if I specify a property as well. So here, as you can see, the width jumps immediately to the end value, but the height takes 1 second to start transitioning. And you might be wondering, why would I need to do this? But both of these features become much more useful if I tell you that you can use multiple transitions with different parameters if you separate them by commas. So I can specify a 1 second width transition followed by a 1 second height transition that waits 1 second before it starts. And if you think about it, what this does is that the width will kick in immediately. The width transition will start immediately after I press my keyboard arrow. But the height transition will wait 1 second, which means the width will have finished transitioning before the height starts, which effectively makes them happen in sequence, as you can see now. So this is almost what I wanted, but not quite. When it closes, it's exactly what I wanted, width first, height second. When it opens, I wanted the height to happen first and the width second. I wanted them to happen in reverse. But here, the width is first and the height second in both cases. So what I need to do is what I showed you before about specifying different transitions for different states. So when the lightbox has the class of current, I can reverse these properties, and it works the way I wanted, both ways. And if I want to make the code more dry, because now if I want to change the duration, I need to change it in 6 places. So if I want to make the code more dry, I can just override transition property, because transition is a shorthand. And this should work the same. But now, if I want to change the transition duration of this, I only need to change it in 3 places, which is half than before. It's still not perfectly dry, but it's a big improvement. And also, since this is a lightbox, why not add an overlay in? So if you remember the CSS code I showed earlier, there's a box shadow here. If I tweak the box shadow a bit by adding another one with 0 offsets, 0 blur, and a very large spread, and making it semi-transparent black, and also adding one here with a completely transparent color, because I want the color to transition, so I need to tell the browser that don't animate the spread, just animate the color. This is why I added this redundant shadow here that does nothing. So now the box shadow doesn't animate. We have an overlay, but there's no animation for it. And that's because we have specified that we only want the width and height to animate. If we add a box shadow transition here, and here, it should also fade, just like we're used to in lightboxes. And we did that with no extra elements, not even pseudo elements, just a box shadow. I've actually used this effect in webplatform.org when I was working at W3C. The video that appears here has a very, very similar transition effect. It's all done with CSS. And in users using IE8 or IE9, what happens is that they just see the window immediately. There's no animation and there's no overlay. Big deal, they can still see the video. Everything works, nothing breaks, just no effects. Here's another common example. Obviously, it's simplified from what you would usually use in a website, but the idea is you have some text, and when you hover over it, some more text is revealed. And that happens because we are transitioning the height. However, if I go here and add another line, you can't see that line because the height is hard-coded. We don't want the height to be hard-coded, so let's specify height auto. As you can see, when I specify height auto, it doesn't quite work. And the reason it doesn't work is that, yeah, what's going on here? The reason it doesn't work is that for a value to be animatable, it should be possible to represent all intermediate states in CSS. CSS transitions and animations work the same way, basically, as what jQuery does. They take the two states and they generate all the intermediate frames. It just happens behind the scenes in the browser, but you should still be able to represent them in CSS, because otherwise, what if you do a getComputed style while an animation is running? What do you get back? You need to be able to get a proper CSS value back, which means when you animate something like a height from 0 to 100 or whatever value, you can figure out what the intermediate states would be. Same when you're doing a transition between colors, because colors are basically still numbers. They're converted to RGBA, and it's just the numbers that are interpolated. Same with transforms. It's all numbers. Even weird things like z-index can still be animated. It's just that the intermediate states are all integers because they only accept integers. But you can still animate them. But what happens when you have height auto to 100 pixels? What's the intermediate state? How can you say something that's 25% auto and 75% 100 pixels? There's no such value. Or when you want to show something by setting display from none to block, what are the intermediate states? Same with an image. How can you say something that's 30% foo JPEG and 70% bar JPEG? There is a caveat here. Gradients. Gradients are all numbers because they're just functions with colors and color stop positions. So you would expect that the intermediate values would be something like this. So you would expect you'd be able to animate them. However, browsers are being dicks here, because you can't really animate gradients today in today's browser. You should be able to eventually. It wasn't the spec, and it wasn't CSS image values 3, but it got removed because no browser implemented it. However, don't be sad, because there are lots and lots of things you can animate in CSS. I've created a gallery here. You can find it on my GitHub with animations with just a single property, and it's kind of impressive what you can do by animating just one property. So imagine what you can do if you animate lots of properties together. This is my favorite. Kind of makes you wonder if you're drunk. And especially if you animate transforms, you can create really interesting stuff. Especially CSS transforms, CSS 3D transforms, as you can see here. And even when you want to make stuff appear, even though you can't animate, you can't make it animate when you're just hiding and showing it with display none and display block, you can still use other ways to hide and show things. For example, if you use a transform instead, actually, let me show you first that it doesn't work, just in case you don't believe me. If I do a transition of 1 second, still nothing. But if I hide it with a transform instead of a transition and show it with a transform, now it animates. And obviously this is not very useful, but if I set the transform origin to be somewhere horizontally in the center, vertically at the top, well, I still need to fiddle with it a little bit, maybe minus 10 pixels. Anyway, it's starting to become something that would be more desirable. Obviously, you need to fiddle with it a little bit to do exactly what you want. And yes, in this case, this doesn't degrade gracefully. Because if transitions and animations are not supported, you just have it there at all times. It doesn't hide and it doesn't appear. So you should use something like Modernizer to detect whether transitions and transforms are supported, and and apply different CSS code in those cases. But it's still doable, and the JavaScript code you need to write in those cases is still much, much less than if you were writing the transitions and animations in JavaScript as well. Also, I told you before that you can't do animations between images, but I kind of lied. You can't do transitions between images in CSS image values 3. It was there, but it got removed for the same reason gradient transitions were removed, because browsers didn't implement it. But there is a new crossfade function that does exactly what I said you can't do before, that allows you to specify that you want an image that's 10% foo JPEG and 90% bar JPEG by overlaying one image on another and changing the dimensions. And you might be thinking that CSS image values level 4 is very far from now, but we've already started getting implementations. Chrome already supports this and has been supporting this for a while, and Chrome has a very huge market share worldwide these days. And it's been supporting this since April 2012. This is just me animating a CSS logo. There's no crossfade function in the code here. It's just used behind the scenes by the browser to make the transition. Of course, you can use it in your CSS as well if you want. Here's another cool thing you can do with transitions. So here I have a div. When I keep my mouse button pressed on it, and it gets the pseudo class of active, the background changes and the text color changes as well, just in case somebody is colorblind and can't see the background change. So if we add a simple transition here, you can imagine how that would work. It would smoothly transition to these colors and then smoothly back. However, if you recall, we can specify different transitions. So here we can specify a transition that lasts 1 second, and here a transition that lasts 0 seconds, so effectively no transition, but is delayed 1 second. What this does is, when I click on it, there's a transition, it happens smoothly, but when I release my mouse button, it takes a second to go back. So if I use like a very large value here, can you imagine what would work? What would happen? There is a nice transition when I click on it, and then it just stays there. It doesn't go back. So this is effectively a way to maintain state with CSS. And in this example, it's not very useful, although I can still think of some use cases. But somebody used this to make this demo, which is a character controlled by CSS buttons. This is all CSS. There's no JavaScript here. Also, you might, if any of you used Flash before, you might be wondering, yeah, okay, this is cool, but what if I want more fine-grained control on my animation? What if I want to control how the animation progresses from the start value to the end value? So here you can see two different ways for that to happen. The first one is the default, and the second one, in the second one, it progresses linearly, which means at 30% time, it will be 30% through the transition. There's no acceleration, no deceleration, it just happens linearly. But you don't have to even be constrained between those two. You can get the second behavior by specifying the keyword linear. And there are a few other keywords, like ease in, which speeds up towards the end. There's also ease out. But these are just shorthands for a function called cubic Bezier. Cubic Bezier looks like this. and it accepts 4 values, from 0 to 1 usually, but not necessarily. And it's almost impossible to describe this just by showing you the function. It's much easier to describe this graphically, because cubic Bezier corresponds to a Bezier curve from one point to another, and the 2 values are the coordinates of the first handle, and the last 2 are the coordinates of the second handle. So this is basically a graph of how the transition progresses over time. The horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is progression. So if you do something like this, for example, it means that as time goes by, it will start moving towards the end value, then it will slowly go back, and then it will keep going towards the end value, which looks like this. Did you see how it stopped in the middle, went back, and then forwards? And it's really useful if you want to do bounce effects. Look at this. This means it goes towards the end value really quickly, then it jumps further than the end value, and then it goes back to the end value, which creates a bounce. And you can even do bounces like this. Something that bounces before it starts, not at the end. And this app is online at cubicbezier.com, or you can find it on my GitHub. But even though transitions are pretty cool, and they're a huge step forward from what we had in CSS 2.1, they're still quite limited. They can't be fired on page load. For example, if you want to have like an element fall from the sky when the user loads the page, you can't do it. You can't repeat them like 3 times, for example. There's just a start state and an end state, and it's just that. And they can't be about different properties. For example, you can't animate, if the start value and the end value is about background, you can't be animating the color, the text color as well. And this is why the gods of CSS gave us CSS animations. CSS animations are more powerful, but also more verbose, more complicated. So if you can do something with CSS transitions, you should do it with CSS transitions. But if you can't, it doesn't mean you have to resort to JavaScript. You can still do it, sometimes you can still do it in CSS with CSS animations. Although basically, everything you can do with CSS animations, you can also do it with a combination of JavaScript and CSS transitions. So a basic animation, this is a basic animation. It has 2 components. It starts from this dark red background, then it goes to orange halfway, and then it goes to yellow-green. And animations have 2 components. One of them is the keyframes rule that defines the basic states, and obviously the browser interpolates between them as well. And then you need to use the animation function to bind these, to specify where you want to use this transition. And the animation property, did I say function? I meant property. The animation property is very similar to the transition property. It takes a time value as well. Here's 1 second. And instead of a CSS property, it takes the name of an animation you've defined. In this case, rainbow. So you can see how our animation happened, and then it went away, and we can see the background that we had before. So we can make it repeat by specifying a number here. Let me remove it and reapply it. So now it will happen 3 times, and then it will stop again. And if we don't want it to ever stop, we can specify infinite. And now it will just keep on animating. But I'm going to stop it because otherwise some people here will get seizures. Also, 0% can be written as from, and 100% can be written as to. And you don't even need to use both of them. If one of them is missing, the browser will just generate it from the normal state. So if I remove this, instead of animating from dark red, the browser will animate from the slate gray background I have now. So let me remove the animation and reapply it. So as you can see, although I should probably make it a bit longer, it animates from the state, from its normal state towards orange and yellow-green, and then it jumps back. This is another example. I'm animating this heart from a transform of none to a scale of 120%, which makes it look like it's pounding, but it doesn't look very smooth. So one way to make it smooth is to change this to 50% and change this to from and to. And this should be double. Why is Chrome not applying my CSS? Let me remove it and reapply it. Yep, that works. So now it seems more smooth, but it's still unnatural. And the reason it's unnatural is because when it grows, the timing function, remember those cubic Bezier values I showed you earlier? So when it grows, it has a certain timing function of ease, which is the default in this case. But when it shrinks, the timing function doesn't reverse. It just keeps being the same, which makes it look unnatural. However, there's a better way to do this. This is a simple animation from a background of yellow to a background of blue. I can bind it by doing something like this and specify 3 iterations. And because Chrome is an idiot, remove it and reapply it. So as you can see in this case, it goes smoothly from yellow to blue, and then it just jumps back to yellow so that it repeats. This is its progress over time. We can change this behavior by using the property animation direction. If we specify an animation direction of alternate, instead of looking like this, it looks like this, which means every second iteration is flipped. It's reversed. So it goes smoothly from yellow to blue, and then smoothly from blue to yellow, so the whole animation is smoother. And if I remove this and reapply it, you can see how it smoothly goes from blue to yellow in the second animation, which makes the whole thing smoother. And there's also reverse, which reverses every single iteration, and alternate reverse, which is a combination of alternate and reverse. It reverses the first iteration, the third iteration, and so on, every odd iteration. So how can we take advantage of this here? If we specify the keyword alternate, we instantly made it smoother, and it looks even more natural. Well, I first need to make this the way it was, from and to. And copy, cut and paste it. Okay, this was how it was in the beginning. If I specify the keyword alternate, it suddenly becomes much smoother, and I can now reduce the duration. Oh, Chrome is so annoying. There you go. Just by using a keyword. This is a bit of a different example. It's a very common caveat. Here I have a border animating from 0 solid to 100% solid. So it's basically just the border width animating. And I've applied the animation here, but there's no border. I can't see any border, I can't see any animation. And it's not because the color is missing, because when the color is missing, it just gets the text color, which is black. I can even include a color if you don't believe me. It still won't work. Can anybody imagine why it doesn't work? The reason it doesn't work is that border is just a shorthand of border width, border style, and border color. In this case, border width and border color are animatable, so it's fine. But border style is not animatable. You can't go from none, which is the default value, to solid with an animation. It's just either none or solid. There's no such thing as 50% none and 50% solid. So since border style is not animatable, it's dropped from the animation. It's like it doesn't exist. And since it doesn't exist, you get the default border style, which is none. So if you specify a border style here and reapply the animation, oh, I specified none, solid. If you specify a border style of solid here, you can start seeing the animation, because the border style is not defined in the keyframes now. This behavior will actually be changed. That was a resolution we made in the CSS Working Group last year. Browsers haven't caught up with it yet. And actually, it was this example in a doublet that I presented and made the CSS Working Group change its mind. And this is a PNG file with 10 frames of an animation. This is some CSS code that applies to this div. Whoops. And let me show you what the boundaries of the div are. This is our div. It has a width of 50 pixels and a height of 72 pixels. And we want to have a frame-by-frame animation. I mean, we already have our frames here. And this div is basically functioning as a sprite. So if we manually change this to 50 pixels, we can see a different frame. With 100 pixels, we can see another frame. Minus 150 pixels, another frame. So if we manually change this, we can see all the different frames. So we want to do this with a CSS animation. So our naive first approach would be to write the keyframes rule from to background position minus 500 pixels and 0. We don't need to write the from rule because, like I said before, it will be generated from this value, which also makes it degrade gracefully very easily, because in browsers that don't support CSS animations, you just don't get an animation, you get the first frame. And let's tie the animation, I didn't specify a name, wave. Let's tie the animation here with our element. So you can see how this didn't go down very well. This is not a frame-by-frame animation, it's just awful. And even if we specify a linear keyword so that it doesn't accelerate and decelerate like this, it's still weird. This is not a frame-by-frame animation. So, should we give up? Is it impossible to do a sprite animation in CSS? Should we use JavaScript? Actually, no. Because we don't just have cubic Bezier easing functions, we also have another type of easing functions, which is steps. And steps just makes abrupt changes, but lots of them. How many? As many as the parameter you specify, which is very useful for frame-by-frame animations. And you might be wondering, why do I need another way to create animated GIFs? Why? Why is this useful? The reason this is useful is that this way you can animate images that have alpha transparency. GIFs don't have alpha transparency. So for example, if you want to have like a spinner on top of your whatever, and you don't know what background it will be on, it will be much better to do it this way than use an animated GIF which needs to have a specific background color. And yes, there was an image type that was supposed to do this. It was called APNG. And some browsers do support it, but you might be surprised to hear that APNG has worse browser support than animations. This is the spinner here, by the way, was done this way. And this is another nice function of steps. This is a typing animation. There are two animations in play here. One of them is the typing animation, which animates the width from 0 to your final width. And this one animates the caret here, and it makes it blink, also with steps. This is all the code this needs. And since the steps are not hard-coded in the keyframes rule, but here, you can also set them with JavaScript. And it's also using the CH unit, which many of you might not have seen. The CH unit corresponds to the width of the 0 character, which is useful when you have monospace fonts like this, because the width of the 0 character is the same as the width of every character. And in case animations are not supported, this is what people will see, which still communicates the same effect. There's no animation, but the text is still legible. And it kind of looks like a console type thing. So It's not horrible when animations are not supported, it's just better when they are. And this is the whole point about graceful degradation. This is another case, and I'm running out of time. So a while back, a friend of mine, Chris Coyer, if you've heard him from CSS Tricks, came to me and he was like, how can I make an element rotate in a circular path without the actual element rotating? Because here it is rotating in a circular path, but the element is also rotating as well. We don't want that, we just want it to move in a circular path. So at first I thought it couldn't be done, but after a while I came up with a solution of using two transforms on two different elements and having one of them cancel the other, which would look like this. I have two reverse rotations. At any point, each rotation cancels the other. I have two elements. A different transform origin and a different animation applies to each of them. So one of them cancels the other, so you see no rotation, but you just see the movement. And you can make it even shorter if you use animation direction. So you can eliminate this, and instead of overriding animation name, override animation direction, which just generates this counterclockwise animation on the fly by using animation direction reverse. And if I remove this and reapply it, you can see that it still works with less code. But you still need two HTML elements. However, when I wrote to the CSS Working Group and asked them to allow people to specify different transform origins on the same element, so you don't need two elements to do this sort of thing, a guy called Aryeh Gregor wrote back to me, and he was like, you can do this today. It's just that the syntax is not very intuitive. And you can do it this way, by using a transform that rotates an element, then translates it by a fixed amount, and then rotates it back by the same amount of degrees it was rotated earlier, which means the two rotations cancel each other, but you still see the translation. Because the thing with transforms is every transform operates on the coordinate system that the previous transform set. They're not independent. Their order matters. So the element rotates, then it moves, and then it rotates back. So you see the movement, but you don't see the rotation. It did take me like a few months to understand how that worked. So as this talk is close to its end, this is pretty much what I covered. So there are still things that you can read about if you're interested in transitions and animations. One of them is animation fill mode. That specifies how your animation behaves when it's not playing. And also the events, there are lots of events files like transition end, animation start, things like that that you can use in JavaScript to do cool stuff. And before I finish, a short reality check. The code I showed you looks like this. But unprefixed transitions have much worse browser support, only 60% of browsers. And prefixed animations are even worse. Only 1 out of 4 users will be able to see unprefixed animations. So even though the code I showed you looks like this, the actual code looks like this. And yes, I know this is horrible, but there are ways to make your code more dry. One of them is my library, prefix-free. It's pretty short. You just drop it in your page, write unprefixed CSS, and it just makes stuff work. There are some alternatives. Some websites you can go and put in your code and gets prefixed. There are also preprocessors where you can write mix-ins, but you have to write the mix-ins yourself. And yes, I know this is a bit depressing, so here's a picture of a donkey laughing to cheer you up before I leave you. Here are some resources. You don't need to write them down. My slides are online. And if you have any questions, you should find me at the breaks, because we don't have time right now for questions. Thomas is already kind of pissed off, I think. So that was it. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much.